discussed it other than I tell him what's in the news about it.
And what's his reaction? What does he say?
Go tell him that I need a pardon. Go tell him I deserve a pardon. That's what he said.
That's Diddy's lead defense attorney giving the exclusive to CBS Mornings. And get this, while Diddy faces a possible 20-year sentence, is he still planning a music comeback?
He said, well, he's going to be back in Madison Square Garden.
Doing what?
I guess being on stage, you know? I mean, and I said, I'll be there.
The courtroom was heavy with silence. The kind of silence that doesn't simply exist in the air, but presses against the skin, suffocating, inescapable. Every seat was filled, every corner occupied, every single person inside aware that they were about to witness a moment that would ripple far beyond the four walls of that room.
Sex trafficking of Cassie, not guilty. Sex trafficking of Jane, not guilty. Transportation to engage in prostitution, Cassie, guilty. Transportation to engage in prostitution, Jane, guilty. That was the historic verdict out of the Sean Diddy Combs criminal court today. A split verdict after almost 13 hours of deliberations and weeks of testimony and evidence and arguments. The 12 jurors acquitted Sean Combs of the more severe charges, the ones that carried the stiffest prison sentence, potentially 15 years to life in prison, but convicted him of the Mann Act charges, which, by the way, carry up to 10 years in prison each, although I will tell you in a filing today from the government, it appears the sentencing range they're looking for is 51 to 63 months, so 4 to 5 years. However, there is no mandatory minimum. So would the judge go lower? We'll talk about what the defense is asking for too. And also, whatever the sentences are, would he combine the sentences consecutively, one after another? Maybe, maybe not. A lot of questions, but I'll tell you what. You would think that the verdict would be just the only big part of today. You would think that's the only major decision. Not the case. Because we got to talk about what happened later on in the day. The bail hearing. Right after the verdict, it was a question of should Sean Combs be granted release while awaiting sentencing, which the judge set today, by the way. Sort of set the sentencing date. I'll talk more about that as well. But I mean, let's talk about Sean Combs. He's been locked up since September 2024. He's been denied bail at each turn. There was a change of circumstances here. He had just been acquitted of 3 of the charges. So, could he make bail?
Today's a great victory. It's a great victory for Sean Combs. It's a great victory for the jury system. You saw that the Southern District of New York prosecutors came at him with all that they had. They're not stopping, but one thing stands between all of us and a prison, and that is a jury of 12 citizens.
Whole criminal trial, 7 weeks of testimony and a verdict that ended in Sean Diddy Combs' conviction on 2 federal sex crimes charges. Could he be pardoned by the President of the United States? You know, that is a question that came up a lot when we were doing the live streams of the Diddy trial every day on YouTube. I never really considered it as a real possibility, but I'll tell you what, now, based on current reporting, we may have to take this seriously. Oh, and in terms of relief for Diddy, we also have to get into his defense team's new memo that they filed arguing that his conviction should be thrown out, or at the very least, he should get a new trial. We're going to talk about that too. And by the way, let me tell you, we have an amazing guest who I'm going to be bringing on in a little bit, somebody who actually helped secure federal pardons for his clients, including from President Trump, and is an expert in criminal law, has been following this case from the very beginning. I'm going to bring him on in a little bit. But why do I say that we have to take pardons seriously now? Why? Well, TMZ has reported that President Donald Trump's administration has been talking to Diddy's legal team about a potential pardon, a forgiveness for a federal crime. It's enshrined in the Constitution. Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1, the president shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. And according to TMZ, his decision to pardon Diddy may be determined based on if Judge Arun Subramanian grants Diddy bail, which, by the way, we dedicated a whole sidebar to the other day. His team just filed a brand new letter with the court asking for him to be released. I broke it down, discussed all those arguments. But TMZ also has reported that the pardon decision could also...
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
The tension wasn't ordinary. It was sharp, cutting, alive. The man at the center of it all sat slouched at the defense table, his once confident posture replaced by something brittle, fragile, uncertain. Sean Combs, known to the world as Diddy, the mogul who had built empires out of sound and image, was now reduced to waiting like everyone else, waiting for words that could erase his life as he knew it. The guilty verdict had already been announced days earlier. That moment alone had shocked the world. But what came next would define everything. The sentence. The final judgment. The number that would determine how many years this man, once untouchable, would spend locked behind bars. It wasn't just a sentence. It was a reckoning. Diddy's eyes darted around the courtroom, searching, scanning, hoping to find some familiar face that could offer comfort. But what he found instead were cold stares. Reporters scribbling furiously, cameras flashing, strangers leaning forward with anticipation.
For Diddy, I would certainly look at the facts. If I think somebody was mistreated, whether they like me or don't like me, it wouldn't have any impact on me. He used to really like me a lot, but I think when I ran for politics, that relationship busted up from what I read. I don't know, he didn't tell me that, but I'd read some little bit nasty statements in the paper all of a sudden. And Diddy had been photographed with Trump over the years. There was some sort of relationship there. President Trump even called him a good friend on a 2012 episode of his TV show The Apprentice. The problem is, some comments Diddy made about Trump in recent years as Diddy really entered the political realm. There's a video where he's speaking to radio host Charlemagne saying, if Trump gets elected, I really do believe in my heart there'll be a race war. In another video on Revolt, he says white men like Trump need to be banished. And by the way, you know who's not letting anyone forget this? Combs' rival 50 Cent. Took to social media recently, wrote, see, Trump don't like S like this, buddy. You run your mouth too much. And Donald doesn't take well to disrespect and doesn't forget who chooses to go against him. While working tirelessly to make America great again, there is no room for distraction. He would consider pardoning anyone who was being mistreated, not Puff Daddy. And let me tell you, the idea of Trump pardoning Diddy is not getting a ton of love out there. Conservative commentator Megyn Kelly posted on X, Trump should not pardon Diddy. He doesn't deserve it. He's a Trump hater. He's a woman abuser. MAGA is already upset over elites seeming to cover for each other. This would not help. GOP struggling with young female voters, most of whom will hate a Diddy pardon. And then you just had other random accounts like America First. What? He's actually considering this? Diddy is a depraved, abusive, sexual deviant who should be spending the rest of his life in prison. If Trump pardons him, he will get absolutely crushed. Who is advising him lately? It's looking like straight up sabotage at this point. There were other accounts that were not in favor of it, although there was this account. Milo posted on X, Trump has no choice but to pardon Diddy after the government, led by James Comey's daughter Maureen, simply lost interest in Diddy's guilt the moment they secured his tapes incriminating powerful Democrats. The prosecution was a shambles. The trial was a farce. Now, I want to talk about if this is really going to happen, how it would happen. Also, if it really depends on bail and sentencing, then what are we talking about? And I have somebody who not only has been following the Diddy case from the very beginning, not only is a renowned criminal defense attorney, but actually has obtained federal pardons from the president, including from Donald Trump. By the way, for his clients Kodak Black and Lil Wayne, those were maybe the most notable. I'm joined by Bradford Cohen. Bradford, thank you so much for coming here on Sidebar. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Jess.
Now, before I even get into the pardon, okay, there's a bit of breaking news before we were going to come on. This is what I want to get your opinion on first. So Combs' defense team filed a memo in support of a motion for judgment of acquittal, or in the alternative, a motion for a new trial. And basically, I know you read through it, but basically the evidence, they would say, is insufficient to sustain that conviction. Their main arguments is really echoing what we've talked about a little bit when it came to the bail analysis, but that his prosecution, his conviction on these Mann Act prostitution charges is so unique. He wasn't profiting off of this business. All consenting adults were involved. The jury didn't find that there was any sex trafficking. They argued this isn't even prostitution per se, it's voyeurism, that the intent wasn't for people to travel for sex for money, but he paid them for their time. Everybody was having a good time. He makes a First Amendment argument that the freak-offs and the hotel nights were performances that were typically videotaped so they could watch them later on. It's just amateur pornography. And then finally makes the argument that he was prejudiced because of all the other evidence that came in to prove RICO or sex trafficking, and would have never came in if he was merely being prosecuted for prostitution, particularly the Intercontinental.
Even those who had once celebrated him now sat in silence, watching the spectacle, some with disbelief, others with satisfaction. His lawyers leaned in close, whispering strategy, reminding him of appeals, promising that this wasn't the end. But their voices sounded small, hollow, powerless against the weight of what was about to happen. Then the moment came. The side door opened and the judge entered. Everyone rose, the sound of bodies shifting, shoes scraping against the polished floor, echoing like a slow drumbeat. The judge, robed and stern, carried an authority that no amount of fame, wealth, or history could pierce. When he sat, the entire room lowered with him, the silence deeper than before. A silence so sharp it was almost painful. Diddy stared at him, his lips pressed tightly together.
Something about the defense's argument. Was the defense's argument, hey, all the people who testified against Sean Combs were not being truthful, or were taking their accounts, were listening to their accounts, and what they're saying just didn't amount to a federal crime? Is it a mixture of both? Just trying to understand what the argument was.
I mean, I think it was a mixture. It depended on the witness. And a lot of the witnesses were telling the truth, but the truth didn't hurt Sean. It helped him. There were some people who were shading the truth. The great thing about it was there was a ton of evidence in written communications that people had created at the time, all these text messages. There were videos, and that really helped us expose the truth, because these were things that had been recorded. This is what people were, the girlfriends, others were saying to Sean at the time of the events in question. And so, there was really no way for the witnesses or the government to hide what was in the written documents.
Now, I will tell you, if you had been following what we've been doing here in Sidebar, Law and Crime, we call balls and strikes. So there were, during the course of the trial, we would say, this was the strength of the prosecution, this was the strength of the defense. There was such effective cross-examination of these key witnesses that we all kind of wondered, was the defense going to call any witnesses? And you really did. And what was that decision? Because I understand there were witnesses who were planning to be called. There was an idea to put forward a defense case. There was a choice not to do that. Can you talk to us a little bit more about what that strategy was about?
Sure. I mean, you always have to be ready to put on a case. At the end of the day, what it comes down to at the end of the government's case is how well do you feel it went in for us? And it's always risky to put on a defense case. People don't realize that, but there's always two sides to everything. And if you put on a witness, and even if it's, 70% good, if the prosecution scores some points, it can really undermine you. And so if you feel like the government's case has gone in really well for you, it can be actually riskier to call any witnesses. People don't necessarily realize that, but at the end of the day, we just made a decision that we thought the case had come in well, and we didn't want to, sort of change the dynamic in a way that could be risky for us.
Was Christina Courtroom ever potentially going to be called by the defense? We were all shocked why the government never chose to call her, since, I don't know, her name came up almost every single day through almost every witness. Was there a plan by the defense to call her?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to get into specific plans or non-plans, but it was more of an overall decision just not to put anyone on and just to use a few pieces of evidence that hadn't come in.
What do you think about the prosecution's choice not to call her? Because I will tell you, we did lunchtime shows, live shows with our audience. I would say 80% of the questions that we got during 7 weeks of testimony was, why is she not being called and will she be called? Were you surprised the prosecution chose not to call who was supposed to be the main alleged co-conspirator?
I mean, I don't think so. I think that she would have been a double-edged sword for them, and they probably didn't want to take the risk. As you saw during the trial, even a number of the witnesses that they had always planned to call, that they did put in, kind of blew up in their faces or had positive things to say about Sean that maybe they weren't anticipating. And so it would have been pretty risky for them to put Christina Courtroom on the stand, I think.
There was so much being said about your client in that trial. Obviously in the media, facing a number of different lawsuits. We also wondered.
His jaw tense. He wanted to believe that somehow, some way, the judge might show mercy. That all his years of influence, his empire, his name, his legacy might soften the blow. But the judge's eyes were unyielding, his face carved from stone, his voice steady and merciless as he began to speak. He spoke of the trial. He spoke of the evidence. He spoke of the testimonies that had piled up, one after another, painting a picture that was impossible to deny. He reminded the court of the charges, the crimes, the impact on victims, the stain on justice. Every word was deliberate. Every pause was a dagger. Each sentence hammered down like a gavel of its own, pushing Diddy further and further into despair. The mogul's face shifted as the words poured out. At first, there was defiance. His eyes hardened, his jaw clenched, his fists tightened in his lap. But as the judge continued,
as far as our sentencing date goes, and then the judge's clerk is like, oh, okay, so both parties agree, and then this matter is adjourned.
And that was it. I worried that's what was going to be, because when they had the letter basically working out the date, I was like, oh, what are they going to talk about? And then after that hearing is when they switched it back to October 3rd. Yeah. So not much there. You didn't see Sean Combs. Okay, let's talk about some other things that have been going on. First of all, big news, there's a new lawsuit that came out against Sean Combs, okay? This is pretty disgusting. You have this unidentified John Doe who claims that in September of 2020, so relatively recently, he, Diddy, and others, they go to this warehouse out in LA. that apparently contained some of the clothes of Notorious B.I.G., the rapper who was shot and killed in 1997, Sean Combs' friend. And people start taking drugs. They start wandering around this warehouse. And this John Doe claims that Combs started watching pornography on his phone. And that is when he claims, again, warning, pretty disgusting allegation, that Combs grabbed one of Biggie's t-shirts and pleasured himself with it, into it. I don't know how the best way to explain it. And even alleging that John Doe, or insisting that John Doe finish the job, so to speak. And he then claimed Combs threw the spoiled shirt onto John Doe and said, "Rip Biggie," then left. He also claimed that 15 years earlier, Combs told him to perform oral sex on him, reportedly suing for intentional infliction of emotional distress, sexual battery. Don't have a ton of information, but for somebody who has been following so many of the civil lawsuits that he now faces, 66, 67, 68, how does this fit into all of them?
Well, it seems like it's just kind of showing a pattern that all the lawsuits seem to kind of allege of power, control, sexual pleasure, all of that stuff. I would say the timing of it is a little surprising given that it came after the verdict a little bit, but I think it kind of, again, goes to that pattern that a lot of the other civil suits we've seen, and these can be by just different attorneys too. It's not always the same attorney who's filing these suits, but it seems like they all kind of go to this pattern, it seems. But again, I'm just more surprised at the timing of it and when this was filed too.
To be clear, there are lawsuits that he's facing that contain allegations that were never discussed in any way in the criminal case.
Right.
But in the criminal case, was it ever alleged that he sexually assaulted men? Was it ever alleged that he grabbed men or forced them to do things, or was it mostly focused upon women?
It seems like it was mostly focused on women, and that
Okay.
being the victims in this case. I think as far as just kind of the allegations towards men were really just having to do with the escorts or the entertainers, as they were also called in the criminal trial. But for the most part, it seemed like from what we heard in the criminal trial, which I know a lot of people are a little disappointed because they thought it would be a lot more, but really it was just kind of like just different isolated incidents involving two victims, being Jane and Cassie. But it seemed like there wasn't a lot of discussion about male victims in this trial, but there were little points that were brought up in terms of like the civil matters, those including like Bonna and her civil claim, Dawn Richard and her civil claim. I think even during the cross-examination of Cassie, one of the defense attorneys, that would be Anna Esteval, she had asked, was the baby oil laced? And I was thinking back to the civil claims, because a lot of civil claims had, a lot of civil suits had claimed that
And it wasn't laced.
That it was, the civil suits claimed it was laced, but then in the criminal trial, Cassie had confirmed that the baby oil was never laced with any type of narcotics or anything like that.
By the way, Combs' legal team said in a statement to Page 6, quote, "Mr. Combs' trial and acquittal on trafficking and RICO charges proves what we..."
The bravado melted away. His lips trembled. His breathing grew shallow. His hands, once steady, began to shake. He leaned back, then forward, then back again, as if his body itself couldn't decide whether to fight or collapse. And then the moment arrived. The sentence. The words that no one could take back. The judge looked directly at him, his voice cutting through the air with brutal clarity. He announced a number so staggering, so heavy that it seemed to freeze time. The room gasped. Some spectators clutched their mouths in shock. Others muttered in disbelief. Even the reporters, trained to remain composed, faltered in their writing as the reality hit them. Diddy's reaction was immediate and explosive. His jaw dropped, his eyes widened, his face contorted with disbelief. Then came the outburst. His hands slammed against the defense table, the sound reverberating through the courtroom. His voice cracked, sharp, desperate, furious.
My entire time looking at the case, the charges, and listening, to the evidence as it came in during trial, I thought that depending upon how a person, be it a juror, be it the public, comes into the trial believing how someone who's a victim should act and how they believe relationships can evolve or devolve and fall apart, is the lens that they would then make their verdict. Why I say that is because if you think a person who's battered, someone who's been a victim, someone who's been assaulted in the ways that were described, most people have an idea as to how they will respond and act towards that, or their expectation if it happened to their loved one, how they'd expect their loved one to act. And in those situations, you don't expect someone to be tweeting, you don't expect somebody to be sending texts telling their abuser that they love them or that they want more of what took place. However, there are other people who are going to who see it from maybe more so the lens of a victim or someone who's been abused, who would say, you know what, that's not so beyond the pale of reason, because the abuse has been so entrenched in this person's mind that they then fall in love with their abuser. And so that's not something that they would, look askance upon or look down upon. So, one of the things about being in trial that I always remind my clients, is that despite all the rules that the judge gives people, no one leaves their life experience or their opinions at the courthouse door. It all makes its way into the courtroom and ultimately into the jury room. And that's why you can see such people who are on one side, like celebrating Diddy being acquitted on the much more serious charges, and other people who are like, how did this happen? I am upset. I feel like victims did not get justice today.
Right, exactly. And emotions did run really high, especially when the verdict came down, because I think I myself was pretty surprised at some of the jury's decisions in relation to some of the charges where they found him not guilty. But, obviously they made their decision. They listened to the evidence. They saw all the exhibits, and they made the decision that they did. And say come sentencing that Sean Combs is sentenced to maybe a couple years behind bars in prison. But do you think even after this trial, after everything that we've learned, after the many civil lawsuits that were also filed, do you think that there's any type of way that Sean Combs can have a comeback at this point?
Well, I think there's certainly a comeback that could be crafted and created in which we as the public may see. Listen, this is a person who has lived his life in the public light, in the limelight for decades. Okay. And so, as has been said before, fame is one of the more addictive or most addictive drugs known to man. And so he was a very famous, and now some might say infamous person. The idea that he allows the narrative to end with the way in which the evidence came in and this kind of mixed bag verdict is not what's the word I'm looking for? If I don't see Diddy allowing the last chapter of his book to be written with this trial, instead, the person that he's held himself out to be and who we now understand him to be is someone who is going to say, look, this was a dark chapter in my life, but now I'm going to show you the phoenix rising from the ashes. And there are other chapters. And I think that he will make an even more concerted effort to be more philanthropic, to be more of a victim's advocate. And also, once he completes these programs, he can say, look, I was once an abuser.
Number, he shouted, shaking his head violently, his voice echoing off the walls. He looked around, eyes wild, searching for someone to stop this, someone to intervene. Someone to undo what had just been spoken. His lawyers tried to steady him, their hands gripping his arms, their voices low, urging him to calm down, to stay quiet, to keep control. But he couldn't hear them. He didn't want to. His world was collapsing in real time, and no strategy, no legal maneuver, no whispered promise of appeals could stop the avalanche. He stood, shouting at the judge, shouting at the jury, shouting at the entire system. His words tumbled over each other, incoherent, frantic, desperate. He spoke of his career, his family, his legacy. He begged. He raged. He wept. The guards moved in, their hands firm on his shoulders, pushing him back into the chair. But even as he was forced down, his body trembled with fury, his voice breaking again and again. Tears streaked down his cheeks, mixing with sweat. His face twisted in a...
Talked about the guidelines range being 51 to 63 months. Now, this is before a pre-sentencing investigation and report. Now, the defense, right, they want 21 months. He's already served almost 10. Talk to us about what you're thinking here, because there is no minimum. The maximum's 10. If the judge were to combine it together, like you said, 20 years, feels highly unlikely that would happen. As we're talking, what is a pre-sentencing report investigation? How would it affect this? What do you think the judge is going to do? There's so many different factors to consider here. And it's not like a murder case when it's like, okay, we know what's going to happen. It's like life in prison without the possibility of parole. It's a given. There's room here. What do you think the judge is going to do?
So in federal court, this is actually very interesting. They rely very heavily on those pre-sentencing investigations. So essentially what will happen is there'll be a federal probation officer, and they do these for almost every case, where they will do their own investigation, where they'll talk to family members, they'll talk to employers, they'll talk to neighbors, and they will make a recommendation to the court as to suitability for release, suitability for time. And that's something that federal judges traditionally really adhere to. They tend to put a lot of weight on those, far more than they do in state court. The probation department can make a recommendation, but the DA will certainly have more ability, most of the time, to talk a judge in or out of a sentencing recommendation from the probation department. Federal court is different. They really put a lot of weight on those. So that's something that I think is going to be very interesting. And a lot of that will come down to what the individuals involved in that investigation, even though it shouldn't impact their professional recommendation. It's really, I think we're going to see what they thought of the case. Did they think he got away with something horrific here? Did they think that he was getting railroaded from the beginning? I think that may reflect in the recommendation to the court. But of course, we don't know what that is yet. I don't know. If I'm his defense lawyer, I'm kind of I don't know if I am pressing the gas on that, trying to make this thing go faster. I mean, it's coming up soon enough anyway. I would want to give them the time and not press them, because you don't want a probation officer or anybody in the federal system to feel like they're being rushed.
Right.
Because I think it's very easy to just go, okay, screw it, the guy should stay in.
The prosecution made the point yesterday. They said the point, like, we're not ready to give a really sentencing recommendation. We haven't gotten the report. There's people say, well, maybe he'll get time served, right? He's been locked up. There's other people say, no, the judge is going to throw the book at him. Even though the judge said yesterday, even though I'm denying him bail and I'm looking at certain conditions, this is not reflective or a preview of what my sentencing recommendation or what my sentence will be. But, are we looking at double digits? Are we looking, you think, at 1 to 5 years, time served? I know it's so impossible to ask, but it is a very specific charges he was convicted of. Yeah,
we're not looking at double digits.
Okay.
I cannot imagine the court imposing that. And remember, because this law is so old, and we're in an age of Uber, so literally somebody in New York City, a man or a woman who engages the services of a sex worker who lives in New Jersey, and if they pay for their Uber, that technically is a Mann Act violation.
A portrait of pure anguish. The judge, unmoved, slammed his gavel down, demanding order. But there was no order anymore. The courtroom had erupted into chaos. Spectators whispered and gasped, their voices clashing in the air. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens racing to capture every detail of the meltdown. Cameras flashed, capturing the downfall of a man who once seemed larger than life. The sound of the gavel clashing against the wood repeated again and again, but it was drowned out by the noise of a legacy unraveling in public. When the words began, they didn't come quickly. The judge spoke with precision, with weight, each syllable heavy, each pause a blade hanging over the defendant's head. He recounted the evidence, the testimonies, the disturbing details that had stacked up one by one until the jury had no choice but to declare him guilty. With each word, Diddy's face shifted. First defiance, then disbelief.
Does that give you a sense of what sentencing could be like? Now, to be clear, my understanding is Judge Arun Subramanian even said at the point, if I make a decision on release, it's not indicative of where I'm leaning towards sentencing. I know there's a pre-sentencing investigation still being conducted or has been conducted. There's a lot of factors to consider. But I have to ask about whether this is going to, have an effect on sentencing. Do you believe it's going to have an effect on sentencing? Does it give you a preview of where the judge is lining up? Because my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, you are probably going to be arguing for time served, maybe a minimum of 21 to 27 months. Where do you think the judge is going to go here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to take each step at a time, and that the judge is not going to prejudge that. There's a lot more information he needs to get, not only the pre-sentence report, but we're going to make a very fulsome sentencing submission, and he's going to have, a much more detailed picture. Even, the trial was about the charges, right? And he doesn't have the full picture of all the factors about Sean's life that he's going to consider. There's going to be a big fight about the sentencing guidelines. We think actually we're going to end up arguing for an even lower guideline range than we had originally believed at the time of the verdict, where we didn't have we had like a couple of hours to try to figure out what to say about bail. So, I hope the judge will grant bail, but I feel confident that even if he doesn't, it doesn't necessarily mean he's not going to sentence Sean to time served. He's going to take everything into account when he gets all the submissions. And, I've got a lot of confidence that the judge is going to be fair and not prejudge the situation.
And you also have this motion for judgment of acquittal, that the Mann Act convictions should be tossed out, Combs be granted at a minimum a new trial. Number of very interesting arguments that are present. And it's basically that they're has really never been, as we've talked about, a prosecution conviction on a Mann Act like this, that Combs wasn't profiting off of the business. They were all consenting adults that were involved. The jury didn't find that there was any sex trafficking, that this isn't even prostitution per se. It's more voyeurism, that the intent wasn't for people to travel for sex for money, but paid them for their time. They were all having a good time. There's a First Amendment argument that the freak-offs and the hotel nights were performances that were videotaped so he could watch them later. It's amateur pornography. There's an argument that he was prejudiced because of all the other evidence that came in to prove RICO or sex trafficking, but would never have come in if this was merely a prosecution for the Mann Act violations. Specifically, we talk about the Intercontinental Hotel footage. But couldn't the counter argument be, if you look at the text messages and voice notes and the travel, hotel, the payment documentation, that these charges, the Mann Act charges, could have been proven based on that evidence alone and not anything else about racketeering or sex trafficking?
Well, I think that goes, I don't agree with that. I think that, as we argued in the papers, the government didn't really show that the purpose of the travel was to have sex for money, and that in fact all the testimony and a lot of the other evidence showed that the men were being paid for their time. But even if we were wrong about that one, we have a number of the other arguments that you mentioned that really aren't undermined by those records. So for instance, one of our main arguments is that this statute, which used to be called the White Slave Traffic Act, it has this long history.
Then fear. And then it happened. The sentence. Years upon years, more than anyone had expected, a number so long it echoed across the room like a bomb exploding. Gasps erupted. Some clutched their mouths, others shook their heads in shock. Even the reporters, who had rehearsed headlines in advance, froze as the weight of it hit them. Diddy's reaction was instant. His jaw dropped, his hands slammed against the table, his voice cracked through the silence. "No, no, no," he shouted, shaking his head, looking around as if someone, anyone, might step in and undo what he had just heard. His lawyers tried to steady him, gripping his arms, whispering to calm him down, but he couldn't hear them. He was gone, lost in rage and disbelief. He stood up, shouting at the judge, shouting at the system, shouting at the world. His face twisted with anger, his body trembling. The guards moved in quickly, their hands firm on his shoulders, pushing him back down into the
abuser of women, abuser of drugs, abuser of fame, abuser of power and fortune, but look who I am now. And so I think that's a pretty powerful story. And frankly, people love comeback stories.
Yeah, they do love a good comeback story, but I'm curious, in your opinion, do you think that this is all just for maybe a showmanship, or do you think it's all for PR? So that way, you know, Diddy can walk out of MDC Brooklyn or possibly a potential prison and just be like, you know what, I am a changed person. But also in that same breath, what kind of message do you think that sends to victims out there who may have been abused, or, you know, something had happened to them by a high profile figure? They want to report this to police. They want to either go to maybe a civil lawyer, all of that stuff. But then after this trial, they are like, no, I can't do that. Look what happened in this case. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, there are definitely people who are victims advocates and victims themselves who think that this trial serves to kind of throw cold water, if you will, and chill victims who might want to come forward to express what happened to them, to initiate a criminal case, to initiate a civil case. They look at this case and say, at what cost is it to me personally to have to bare my soul, to only then be grilled on cross-examination, to have all of my intimate details bantied about, you know, in the media, and then to be judged, and then go through all of that, and I walk away in some ways empty-handed. Now, that's certainly one way of looking at things, and there's a lot of credibility as it relates to understanding how someone could feel that way. The flip side, because remember, the scales of justice isn't just one side, there's two sides. The other side, if you will, is at what point in time does a person pay in full their price to society? And then once they've paid the price for their transgressions, at what point do you then look at that person and feel like, hey, you know, you could be a changed person. You can redeem yourself. There's things that you can do to essentially prove to us as members of the public, as clients, as customers, that, you know what, you're a changed man. And so that's the hill Diddy has to climb. Whether he climbs that hill or not remains to be seen. But it's definitely a hill that's in front of him. And some might say it's not a hill, it's a mountain.
It is a mountain for Diddy. I think it might honestly be Mount Everest. It's a large mountain for him to scale for, I think, people to possibly forget in their conscious what we learned in this trial. And I remember when Sean Combs, we've been covering this since Cassie's lawsuit, since 2023, November of that year. And I just remember thinking that there would be some type of reckoning within the hip hop community, the Black community, as far as Me Too goes, something kind of similar. And I thought possibly, and I think maybe other people thought so too, that maybe Sean Combs was kind of that person that would bring about this kind of reckoning in the hip hop community as far as Me Too goes. But do you think that can still happen? Do you think that will still happen?
Well, I think that Diddy's trial, served as a clarion call, a wake up call, canary in the mine, so to speak, as it relates to you could be as powerful, as popular, as wealthy as Diddy. I mean, keep in mind, he called himself Brother Love. He got the key to New York City in the months or the year leading up to all of this, right?
Yeah.
And he was sitting on what some might say is the highest pedestal. And look how far he has fallen. Mm-hmm. Now, at the same time, you have that going on. And so people can look.
The chair. But even then, he wouldn't stop. Tears streaked his face as he pleaded, his voice cracking, his words spilling out in desperation. He talked about his career, his family, his legacy, his innocence. He begged. He raged. He broke. The judge's gavel slammed down, sharp, merciless, calling for order. But there was no order anymore. The courtroom had erupted into chaos. Reporters scribbled frantically, cameras clicked nonstop, spectators murmured in disbelief. And in the middle of it all was Diddy, collapsing under the weight of a sentence he never thought he'd hear. His lawyer leaned in, trying to whisper one last shred of strategy, promising appeals, promising motions, promising hope. But Diddy wasn't listening. His eyes were glassy, his chest heaving, his hands trembling as the reality set in. This wasn't a nightmare. This wasn't a headline. This was real. He was going to prison. For years. The guards pulled him to his feet. His knees buckled as they tightened the cuffs around his wrists. The sound of metal clinking echoed across the room. Final, brutal, undeniable. He turned, looking back at the courtroom, at the people who had once cheered for him, at the cameras that had once glorified him. But there was no applause now, only silence.
They speak to law enforcement, victims. What did the prosecution say about a pre-sentencing report? Anything about that?
Yeah, so the prosecution didn't have as long of an argument today, Jesse, as maybe the defense did, but the government kind of pointing back to case law and saying that they're happy to be working with the probation office. I will say that there was a part, this was after the judge had initially denied Sean Combs bail and being able to walk out of the courthouse today. And I did see when Maureen Comey was making these arguments on behalf of the government that Justin Combs was kind of sitting inside the gallery, really kind of shaking his head. So it seems like from the government's point of view, they just want a little more time to get everything in order in terms of having Sean Combs sit down with somebody, I guess, from the probation office to kind of really do an interview. But the government was like, you know what, the statute is clear. The only thing that's exceptional about this defendant is his wealth, the violence, and his brazenness. He's an extremely violent person. He showed no remorse. His brazenness is unmatched. He used prostitutes. He assaulted Jane, and it was not self-defense. And then the government said something that I don't even think we heard at trial, Jesse. The government said that he invited Jane to the hotel room where Sean Combs was ultimately arrested, where he had the drugs, where he had the lighting set up. And then the defense was kind of, I think, a little upset by the government's argument there because Mark Agnifilo said, you know what, listening to Ms. Comey makes me appreciate that we have jurors. But either way, at the end of the day, bail is still denied for the defendant. So Sean Combs isn't walking out of that courthouse today. He'll go back to MDC Brooklyn, and then we'll see what happens next at his sentencing hearing, or at another hearing prior to that. But then
we'll talk about that. Didn't Mark Agnifilo, push back a little bit? Didn't he push back on the judge's decision a little bit? He had some things to say.
A little bit or a lot of it, Jesse? I think it was more kind of a lot of it. So during the defense's argument there, Mark Agnifilo making these arguments, he said, you know, Your Honor sat through this entire trial. As good as, you know, probations are, you sat through this trial. And they were kind of really pushing for an expedited sentencing hearing. They said that they were willing to waive all those interviews with the probation office and all the different services that the defendant, I guess, has to go through. They were willing to do all of that. And it kind of makes sense, right? Because Sean Combs has already spent a year behind bars. If he were to have an expedited sentencing, it's more likely that he wouldn't be spending so much time with a year already served. So I understand why the defense was making that argument. But
Mark Agnifilo also saying that he understands there was a divide between the parties on what to do next. He says other Mann Acts cases are not remotely similar. He said other cases have to do with minors, or the defendant is considered to be a pimp, and that Sean Combs is entitled to a below guideline sentence. Mark Agnifilo saying that the circumstances aren't related to the family. What's different about this case is, and he's kind of citing different cases here, is one pimp who made money off of dealing with prostitutes, $1.4 million. He pointed out another specific case where the defendant was with a minor and was out pending sentencing. He pointed to a massage parlor who made $1.4 million too, using prostitutes in their parlor. And then he even pointed out a previous sitting governor of New York who used prostitutes, and he pointed out that he wasn't even charged by STNY. And so the defense really kind of pushed back on the judge's decision, and Mark Agnifilo made a really impassioned argument, but the judge really kind of wasn't budging. I think
Only judgment. Diddy collapsed into his chair, his shoulders shaking, his face buried in his hands. His lawyer leaned in close, whispering furiously, promising that this wasn't the end, promising appeals, promising hope. But Diddy wasn't listening. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, staring into the abyss of his own future. The number, the years, repeated in his mind, louder than anything else, echoing like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Finally, the guards pulled him up again. His knees buckled, his body weak. The cuffs were placed around his wrists, the metallic clink echoing across the courtroom. Final, brutal, undeniable. He turned his head, his eyes scanning the room one last time, searching for something. Sympathy, forgiveness, recognition. But all he found were stares. Cold, distant, judgmental stares. The applause of his past was gone. The silence of his downfall was all that remained. As the guards led him away, he cried out again, his voice cracking, desperate, furious, broken. He shouted about injustice, about betrayal, about how this couldn't be happening. But the doors closed behind him, his words muffled, cut off, swallowed by the silence. And just like that, it was over. The mogul, the superstar, the untouchable, reduced to a prisoner. The cameras outside were waiting. Reporters were ready to broadcast the moment to the world. The headlines would explode within minutes. The legacy he had spent decades building had been dismantled in a single sentence. And as the world absorbed the shock, one truth became clear. The man who once seemed untouchable had finally been touched by justice. The silence of the courtroom lingered long after he was gone. Heavy, unforgettable. It wasn't just a sentence. It wasn't just a number. It was history. And the world would never look at him the same way again.